if you're planning on the Foreign Service, plan on being stationed abroad at least something like 2/3 of your career is what the intention. They look for, in examining people to join the Foreign Service, as I mentioned, diversity, also experience abroad. Language will be a plus, and then you have to take the written exam, and then I assume that they will still have an oral assessment, which is this day-long process. The written exam is going to be a little bit different. There are alternatives to the Foreign Service if you're interested in this kind of service, and for some reason it doesn't work out that you get in, or you think you'd like to do something else. There's the Foreign Service is the State Department and includes the political, economic, administrative, consular, and public affairs cones, as they're called. In addition, embassies, particularly mid-sized and larger embassies, will have other agencies of the U.S. government. The Defense Attaché Office have foreign area specialists who work in them abroad, and that's another option. Foreign Commercial Service, Foreign Agricultural Service. And in large embassies, you run into all sorts of agencies. When I was in Paris for 3 years at the embassy, and I think we had representations from something like 20 different agencies and offices of the U.S. government represented there. Federal Aviation Administration, the National War Monuments Administration, and on and on. So the Foreign Service exam is not the only way to get into a Foreign Service career, but it is the main way. And then, of course, there are other agencies of the government that deal with issues abroad as well. There's an interesting other channel that you can go, and I can speak from experience of some of my contemporaries who went that way. When I went the career path, Ambassador Greg Newell, who at about the time that I was belatedly joining the Foreign Service, was serving as ambassador to Sweden. The problem with the political process is, and he was my age, but problem with the youngest U.S. Assistant Secretary of State ever at age 32, and then a very young ambassador. But then, that's a flow-through process. It's not a career process. You're in and you're out, and you have to have the right connections to get there. Policy in the Foreign Service is made in Washington largely and administered abroad. You are delivering the messages out there. There is a personal aspect that's very important. When people think about embassies, they usually think about two aspects of it. The first one that comes to their mind is the consular work, visas and passports. If you get into trouble abroad, you're put in jail, you lose your passport, you get sick, somebody dies, then that's the consular people who take care of that. And so as Americans abroad, that's often what you're concerned with. If you who are interested in foreign policy, then it's often the policy side, which includes the principal leads on that are the political and economic sections in their respective areas, and that covers a large number of issues. And they vary from country to country, and I'll give some examples later of some of the things that we do. Maybe I can mention now just some of what I do in Sweden, which is different from what I've done anywhere else. We don't have a lot of disputes with Sweden. We agree with them on most international issues and just sort of differ around the periphery, and they don't agree with us on Iraq, for instance. They don't like the approach there and have criticized us substantially. But on commercial issues, on human rights issues in general, on fighting the war against terrorism with some specific exceptions, we're very close. The typical week at an embassy in a place like Sweden would mean coordinating, basically lobbying the Swedish government on issues concerning stances that the European Union would be taking, or coordinating something in connection with events going on in the UN, whether it's Darfur or something else. Perhaps démarches, as they're called, regarding events in Somalia or Venezuela or Afghanistan, or dealing with resettlement of persons. And that's what we do. The public diplomacy puts on the public face of the embassy and tries to convince people abroad of the value of the publics abroad of our policies, and this is done via providing opportunities for the ambassador and other officers to speak and address and write letters and deal with significant groups of influential people. Let me tell you a little bit about living abroad. It's not like being on a mission. And that there's some good and some bad things about that. When you go abroad as a representative of the U.S. government, you have a whole huge apparatus behind you. It includes those people in the management or administrative cone of the State Department who are providing your housing and helping you with your transportation of your household effects and helping getting your kids in school, and there sometimes is an international community that you can almost get into a diplomatic bubble where people mostly speak English and you don't get absorbed into the local culture. That's how it's not like being on a mission. Being on a mission, those of you who've done this or lived abroad in another status, perhaps as in the Peace Corps or as an exchange student or whatever, you become an integrated member of the community. And if you've had that experience of being an integrated member of the community, then that'll be a plus for you in being a diplomat. I recall when I was in France, my supervisor, I was a junior officer in the political section in France, and my supervisor was a man who went on to become ambassador in a couple of countries. But during the 3 years that he was in France, he said he never got into a French home. He was never invited to a French home on a social basis, because that's sort of the nature of it. Well, my mission was in France, and so I knew how to get into French homes. And that occurred fairly with some frequency, and provides an added plus to your ability to carry out your duties if you can establish those kind of relationships as well. For a family, and I think you want to take that into account, and we can talk about it in the Q&A if you have particular questions, there are also pluses and minuses. It's a bit of a refiner's fire. If you have a spouse who's trying to carry on a career herself or himself, then that's a challenge abroad, although there will be opportunities not necessarily in the area that you would want. The children will be frequently uprooted every 2 to 4 years, put in a new schooling situation. The schools, there usually are international schools, but they take on the character of the host country. So the international school in Nicaragua will be enormously different from the international school in Ukraine and France and Austria and wherever. You can always put them into the local schools, which we've done occasionally. We have several children, 10, and they all lived abroad, and and that has the advantage that they can have the experience of getting to know more of the language and the culture and such, but it also can put them off track and make it more difficult in some ways to, I think the most difficult year that my children had in school was when we moved back to the U.S. That was and they went to schools in Northern Virginia and found that to be a substantial challenge. But it can also be a plus in terms of that experience for the family. My children have all gone on to universities and to good universities. 3 of them have gone here, and 3 of them to Stanford, and 1 to the Air Force Academy. And it helps to have that kind of background to give them an opportunity to sort of stand out in the application process. They will look a little bit different. Let me give some examples of the work that we've done in different embassies, and then I'll open it up for some Q&A. The personal aspect of diplomacy makes a difference, and one of the places you can see this is the efforts of Chris Hill, who's our Assistant Secretary for Eastern European Affairs, who's working on the six-party agreements dealing with North Korea now. I don't know Chris Hill well, but I've followed some aspects of his career and aware of him. He's a fairly young guy. And he was involved also in the Dayton Accords, if you recall the division and the solution to some extent to the Balkan Wars were going on, and played an effective role as an assistant to Ambassador Holbrooke in that. He's a guy who can handle live wires, and it makes a difference if you have somebody who can do that, and sometimes you just have to know how far you can push, the art of the possible. In diplomacy, you hardly ever get your desired outcome exactly. And if you do, it often won't stand up. It's a negotiated settlement, and the settlements have to be mutually acceptable and give people at least the cover that they need in a certain situation to show that they've represented their country and that their country's interests have been adequately protected. That can depend on a lot of factors. We won't go into all of them, but Nick Burns, who's now the political director at the State Department, the number 3, basically, was the ambassador to NATO, and he made a difference in carrying NATO forward into a new era. Without him and his contributions, the outcome would have been different. Even in little ways, I was the representative to the Finance Committee of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's based in Vienna, Austria, and I was the U.S. delegation's representative. I had negotiating instructions that said I can negotiate up to 13.7% of the contribution would come from the U.S. because we were under a lot of pressure to increase the amount that we paid, because we paid substantially less than we pay as a percentage in the UN, for instance. Well, if you go up 0.1%, it makes millions of dollars of difference. So the how much you yield in those negotiations can make a lot of difference, and we got a good outcome on that. In France, one of the agencies that's represented in the U.S. government is particularly in larger embassies and on a regional basis is the legat, who is the FBI representative, coordinate on legal prosecutions, international matters of international crime, basically. The legat in France was basically under threat of being declared persona non grata, and so we had to pick up and follow up in the connections with the Judge Jean-Louis Bruguière, and you get an opportunity to do some pretty interesting things. The original draft of what became the UN resolution against Libya for its role in the terrorist bombings of Pan Am 103, which was the Lockerbie incident, and UTA 772, which was a French plane that was blown up over Niger, was drawn up at a conference of U.S., British, and French representatives who flew in on Saturday afternoons and had a meeting at the French presidency's Élysée Palace, and I was the note taker. And so the original draft I have. And you can make small contributions in terms of the substance of those kinds of things. Ukraine, I went there with the explicit hope, and we declared this publicly, that we hoped that Ukraine would establish a closer relationship with NATO, eventually become a member of NATO. Very soon thereafter, they were involved in a scandal about the possibility that they had been selling radar-like equipment, a detection system, to Iraq, and this was before the Iraq War. And so instead of promoting a closer relationship with NATO at that time, and we dealt with Ambassador Shamshur, who was the Deputy Foreign Minister at the time, who was here today. Did any of you come to hear Ambassador Shamshur on Ukrainian relations? You missed a good opportunity. He's an articulate man. we ended up investigating at an international commission, the Brits, the U.S., and Poland, whether Ukraine had been involved in a proliferating activity that would be destabilizing. And then we had to deal with that, and the consequences ran up right through the Orange Revolution. Many of the Orange Revolutionaries we dealt with, met with on a frequent basis. I've been in President Yushchenko's office before he was even a candidate. And, he was the one who was pitted by the poisoning, the president of Ukraine, that was poisoned. He was a very careful about what he ate. It was probably one of the only places in Ukraine where you would have organic grapes as what they would offer you to eat in his office instead of some sort of canapé. So the stories that were circulated as disinformation as to what had happened to him were disingenuous. He was poisoned. Nicaragua and the Sandinistas, you're too young to remember them, but the revolution that was fought in the late 1970s and the government of Nicaragua in the 1980s was headed by Sandinistas and Daniel Ortega, who just got elected to be president of Nicaragua again. Has anybody been to Nicaragua? Strange place. We lived there for 3 years. But Daniel Ortega, you get an insight into some of these people and their situations that can inform how you deal with the policy so that the personal side of it matters. When I was there, and I was also head of the political section there, we had very limited contact with the Sandinistas, but we wanted to have contact with them because they were the main opposition party in the parliament there, the Asamblea Nacional. And so I was the one who had that contact, and so I got to know Daniel and Humberto Ortega and their friends. The personal side matters a lot. Another example of that is the man who was just elected vice president of Nicaragua is Jaime Morales. Jaime Morales was a Contra leader when Daniel Ortega was the head of the Sandinistas. And the house that became the Sandinista party headquarters was seized and taken over in the early 1980s when Jaime Morales was out of the country. It was Jaime Morales' personal home, which is now the headquarters of the Sandinista party. But they've reached an accommodation, and now, in addition to having his party work out of Jaime Morales' house, erstwhile house, Daniel Ortega has chosen him to be his vice presidential candidate, and that's part of what's called El Pacto. But we won't go into that. It's kind of a dirty business. In Bolivia, things were focused on the drug war. Believe it or not, the U.S. Embassy in Bolivia, a country of 7 or 8 million people, one of the poorest in the Western Hemisphere, had at the time that I was there 400 Americans working for it. It's an enormous presence. A lot of them were Drug Enforcement Agency officials and others who were involved in that effort. And so domestic issues can drive what happens. In Guatemala, I worked on what became the first successful extradition of a Guatemalan to the U.S. on murder charges. And in Sweden, we did something very strange. Since we don't have any problems with Sweden, all of our problems with them tend to be about third country nationals and some of the opportunities also. Does anybody know where Aceh is? Indonesia. Anybody been there? Been to Indonesia? Well, you know that there's been a very successful diplomatic effort in Aceh to have it acquire a small measure, not of autonomy, but of a certain special status vis-a-vis the government of Indonesia, and they were fighting for independence. And the leaders of their fight, it was a group called the Free Aceh Movement, which uses the initials GAM, G-A-M. The leaders were in exile in Sweden. And so when there was a negotiation that was set up, which took place under the auspices of Adasari, who is the man who is now leading the Kosovo negotiations on behalf of the UN, Special Representative, former President of Finland. Then we made a number of contacts and interventions with the GAM leaders in exile in Stockholm to help move that process forward, and there were successful negotiations. A war was avoided. I think I'll stop there. One thing that happens in diplomacy is that you can't really prove your successes. If that diplomatic effort hadn't failed, had failed, if that diplomatic effort had failed in Aceh, there could have been an increase in the level of what had been a low-level civil war to a higher-level civil war. That didn't happen. And we'd like to take credit for it. The State Department on a very modest budget vis-a-vis that of, for instance, the Defense Department, for having done that, but we can't prove what would have happened if that hadn't. But I think it was a successful outcome, and those kind of outcomes are one of the things that can make a foreign service career useful, and everybody contributes to that. It can also be a very satisfying experience to help solve someone's problem if you have an American abroad and you're working in the consular section and an elderly person dies and you take care of the family, etc. Well, I think I will leave it at that and open up to some questions if you'd like to know anything about anything I can tell you. I can't tell you a lot about the new process of getting into the Foreign Service because they're changing it, but if you'd like to know about living in the Foreign Service, we can talk about that. Yes?
What are the opportunities for furthering education if you are in the FS?
It's not like the Department of Defense that positively promotes that. There are occasional opportunities. There are each bid cycle, every time that it's your turn to change jobs, there are on the job list the possibility of a few assignments to a special program, a master's degree in international relations, where you would be paid to spend a year or 2 years, a year usually, studying at Princeton in that program. There are a few others where sometimes we can tap into the defense college institutes and have opportunities. Other than that, you're pretty much on your own. You don't get the notion is pretty much that with a few exceptions, you will not get a lot of subsequent education paid for. I can tell you, let me take just a minute and tell you who gets into the Foreign Service and what they look like, because the education aspect is part of that. It's about evenly split. This is from a sample class of what's called A100 in May of 2004. 48 women, 47 men. Age ranged from 22 to 56 with a mean of 30. 50 of them were single, 45 were married. Highest degree obtained for 85 of those 95. No, this is wrong. 85 had a bachelor's degree. 94 had a bachelor's degree. 31 had a Master of Arts. 1 had a Master of Science. 17 had MBAs. 8 had JDs. 3 had PhDs. And 3 had other international management degrees. One person, and I didn't even know this was possible, had no degree at all. I thought you had to have a bachelor's degree to get in. They were about evenly divided in their assignments among the management, consular, economic, political, and public diplomacy cones. Spoke 29 different languages, and 63 had 2 or more foreign languages. But in terms of other education opportunities provided by the State Department, you can continue your education. Some people do and end up, for instance, earning PhDs while they're in the State Department if they've already begun it, but it's you won't get a lot of help on it. Yes?
How does the Foreign Service compensate in terms of financially? Do they pay for housing when you're abroad and for schools? If you have 10 kids, are you able to support your family fine?
Yeah. Your housing is provided completely. They pay everything. They even pay utilities. which is why we spend a lot of time abroad. When you're in the U.S., they don't. When you're in the U.S., you're on your own. I have a special resource here I'm going to tell you about if anybody wants to know about what it's like to live abroad. And my daughter just came in back in the back there. Rebecca, I'm going to embarrass you. Stand up so he will. This is Rebecca. She lived abroad. She knows all about it. So if you want to know what it's like growing up in the Foreign Service, you can ask Rebecca after. Thanks. The other, they have a, also they do adjustments both for hardship and for cost of living. In a place like Sweden, you don't get any hardship pay, but you do get a cost of living. They figure that it costs substantially more to live in Sweden, which it does, even with the housing allowance, than it would to live in the U.S. And you receive a tax-free supplement to your salary, which would range anywhere from $10,000 to $35,000 a year, depending on your grade and salary, et cetera. Yes?
I had a general question. Not that I'm particularly interested in it, but the people who conduct these interviews as part of the consul, or who are those people exactly for visas for foreign people wanting to come to the U.S.?
Okay, it's a good question. I'm going to come back. There's one part of your question that I didn't answer, which I'll come back to, which is about schooling. Yeah, and then we'll come back to the visas. The schooling aspect, the State Department will pay for schooling at a private school in the host country, and if that school is considered adequate, then that's the limit of what they will pay is whatever the tuition is for that school. If that school is considered inadequate, then they will pay for school away from post, which is a substantial benefit, which can run something close to $30,000 a year per student. But who wants to send their kids off? Rebecca went off to boarding school for a while, but to Interlaken. The quality of the schooling varies enormously, and as I mentioned earlier, it tends to track the cultural value that the host country places on education. So if you're in a place like Nicaragua, the international school is going to be really, frankly, pretty lousy. It was pretty lousy. If you're in France or Austria, it'll tend to be higher. Ukraine was actually quite good at the international school. And we have occasionally put the kids in some different kind of schooling situations that most people don't do. I have 3 children who are going to Swedish music schools in Swedish now, the 3 who are in Sweden. And when they were in Nicaragua, some of them went to a German school in Nicaragua because it was the best school in the country, and they did everything in German and Spanish. And in France, they went to French public schools, some of them. In fact, all of them, special French public schools. So it can be an opportunity for your children to learn a language, but it's not easy. And then the visa consular issue. Every Foreign Service officer, when they come out, with rare exceptions, spends their first or their second tour, or sometimes parts of both, doing visas, no matter what cone they're in. So the people doing those interviews for visas are primarily first tour or second tour officers who are paying the price. It's really kind of and that's whether they're econ, consular, management, they all, political, all do those. But that's where you get the best stories and the best experience. I mean, the consular, some people really like the consular work, and it is very interesting. It can be really quite strange, but I'll tell you a story about it, just so you can know how strange it can be. I did my first tour in Guatemala, And so I was doing consular work. It's the only time I've done consular work. And I was doing a visa interview for one day, and this guy about 5 feet 2 inches tall came up to the window and said he wanted a transit visa to go through Miami to Canada, because he was going up to, and I said, what for? He says, I'm going to an international arm wrestling competition. And like I said, he was 5 foot 2 inches tall. He was built quite well. And I had a hard time believing him, frankly. And I said, okay, I'll arm wrestle you for a visa. I was a little stronger and stouter then than I am now. And we came back, he slammed me down in nothing flat, and he gave him a visa. But I'd asked him what categories he was arm wrestling champion in, and he said all of them, but he could beat me. So we gave him his visa, but you have to be creative. And I know of an officer one time that a troop came in saying that they did a bicycle act for a circus, and so he made them come and perform their act for him before they could get their visa. Another officer who gave visas to a band that was going up to compete in an international fireman's band competition. I didn't know there was such a thing, but made them come and play their musical instruments, and they got to go. And after that, we kept having these series of bands coming into the embassy asking for visas because they must have stayed. I don't know. But so that's. And they also, the consular officers also take care of the American citizens abroad if they visit them in jail. If they're in jail, try to avoid that, but there always are Americans in jail. Help if an American dies abroad. Sometimes people run out of money, and the government doesn't have any money to give them, but it sometimes it can accommodate helping them find out how to make transfers from abroad, and in an extremis situation can also give a very small amount as a loan. That's the visa side. Anything else? Yes.
Do you, like you were saying earlier, do you get a lot of interaction with people abroad, just depending on what you're doing?
Yes, and basically about as much as you want. But you sometimes have to look for it, and it's different kinds. The management officers are people who are running the embassy. They're providing the motor pool support. They're leasing the housing. They're doing the procurement and the construction and the building. They do all of that as though they're working for a multinational corporation and running their management division abroad. They interact quite a bit with local suppliers, with people that they contract with, etc. The consular officers interact with people coming and asking for visas and services. They probably see more of the local people than anybody else, and usually have to deal in the language a lot. The political and econ officers interact, but with sort of a select group, which is sometimes distorting a little bit. We get to know the people at the foreign ministry very well because we're often going over and meeting with them on issues of mutual interest or concern. We also get to know other ministries, the ministries of justice and interior, the equivalent that they have there, the environmental ministers and such sometimes. So you're dealing with government officials, then you'll also deal with some level of the academic people and in the various areas. The public affairs people deal with the press, with the media, and also with the academic exchanges. So you get some in all of the areas of work, but it's different groups of people that you're dealing with. In political and economic work, you will very often accompany the ambassador wherever he goes. So, and public diplomacy some as well, depending on where he's going. So whoever he meets with, you get to meet with. That's how in Ukraine I met with Yushchenko, the current president, and with our people met with Yanukovych, who's the current prime minister, and with Timoshenko, who's one of the leaders of the opposition, and when you're accompanying the ambassador, and sometimes on your own. Yes?
How does the actual logistics of the language training part work?
You know, if you like to learn languages, that is an educational benefit that is really exceptional in the Foreign Service. When you come in for your first tour, you have a little less ability to control where you go than you may in subsequent tours. And very often, if you have one language, French or Spanish or something, what they consider a world language, they will teach you another language instead of sending you to, and that's a bit of an advantage. And they will normally for first tour, they used to limit it to 6 months. They've extended some of the harder languages to 10 months. That's first tour, and you can learn one language then before you go out. I was on a mission in France, and so when I came in, I still had, I don't know if you're familiar with the language scales of 1 to 5. Yeah. Well, I still tested at a 4 in French, 4, and so they taught me Spanish and sent me off to Guatemala. In subsequent tours, they will not teach a world language. If you don't have a world language, something like French or Spanish, or they even consider sort of the easier and more used languages like French, Spanish, German to be world languages that a lot of people have, and they will teach that if needed for the first tour, but they usually won't teach it for a subsequent tour. But pretty much everything else they'll teach for a subsequent tour. And when they teach it, it's an enormous benefit if you like languages, because you're in language school from 6 to 8 hours a day, and that's your job. That's all you do. And you do it for 6 months to 2 years if you're learning a hard language like Mandarin. And if you like that kind of thing, it's an unusual, probably one of the few places, maybe the military is another one, but where you can get that routinely, and you can get it on more than one language. In addition, if you're at a post where you are not in a language designated position, for instance, I was in Vienna. I was working for our delegation to an international organization, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It's based in Vienna, but the language of the OSCE is English with some French and a little bit of some other languages, but, and I already had those. So they didn't teach me German. But they usually have a at-post option to study mostly on your own time, but maybe with a little bit of off time, the language with some language instructors provided by the State Department. So you can end up acquiring several languages one way or another. Yes?
Well, I guess your career track didn't start out with the Foreign Service. Why did you make the decision to become a Foreign Service officer?
I didn't like being a lawyer. That's pretty much the long and the short of it. Yeah. And I always wanted to do something like that, and it took me a while to discover, what to do. And yeah.
What was your undergraduate?
It was European Studies, which I guess they've resurrected, and they had it sort of as an ad hoc thing back then, but it basically consisted of putting your own program together. They did that for a few years, and I guess it's something like that again now, I heard, but I don't know. I did a lot of French history and philosophy. I was a philosophy minor, and a lot of sort of the geopolitics of Europe. Yes?
How much, say, does your career follow the languages that you already have and, say, area of expertise, and how much do they just kind of like throw you into a completely different sphere of the world?
Sort of as much as you want, you can follow it. there really is, if you're determined about it, a lot of flexibility in how you go about your career. Career is a strange concept. It makes me think of just sort of going around in circles, but not careering around or careening around. But people who want to stick in one area, you usually can do it. So if you want to focus on East Asia, you can. That's probably pretty easy. In fact, they expect it in the hard language places like Japanese and Mandarin, Cantonese, that you'll do more than one tour there. And if you're outside one of those areas and you say, well, now I'd like to go to Japan for 3 years, you're not going to have very good luck. There are some areas that it's easy to come and go from, probably Latin America and Africa, much more easy. But they're not likely generally to send you off on a complete different direction. After you're tenured, which can be 1 or 2 tours in, then the process changes, and the way you apply for your next job is you know that the job you have is going to end. Well, in my instance, I'll be leaving Sweden in July of 2008. The process of deciding where I go and what I do next starts about a year earlier than that. They send out what they call bid lists, which lists all of the posts that are going to come open a year from then, and all of the language requirements, and you have to submit a list of places that you are willing to serve in that includes at least 6 posts, and they have to be in at least 2 geographic areas. And then that's the formal process. Most people submit about 10. The informal process is that then you start lobbying for your next job. If you know people, if there's somebody who wants you at a post, then that's where you can go. Except there are some rules about how long that you have to serve. There's supposed to be a balance between hardship posts and non-hardship. Some people manage to avoid that. My career has been a pretty equitable balance between them. We've done some substantial hardship posts like Bolivia and Nicaragua and Guatemala and Ukraine to some extent, and then some very nice posts like Paris and Vienna and Stockholm. Most people spend more of their time in the U.S. than I do. That's a normal career track. They project that you would spend about 2/3 of your time abroad. I think the average is probably a little higher than that they spend in the U.S. I mean, a little less than that they probably, most people, instead of spending 10 out of 15 years abroad, maybe it's 8 or 9. Yes?
Are the posts in the U.S. all within Washington, D.C.?
The 2 major centers where there are posts in the U.S. are Washington, D.C., and then there's a substantial number at the U.S. mission to the U.S. UN, to the United Nations in New York. Those are the largest ones. There are some others, particularly we've been talking about what are called generalist positions, the 5 cones that I talked about, political, economic, consular, management, and public affairs. In addition, there's regional security officers who are specialists. They're the cops, and they manage the security. They have posts all through the U.S. because they also work on some other items in the U.S. They have posts in San Francisco and in Miami and in some other places. There are some management positions scattered here and there, even some in Charleston. There's a passport office up in New Hampshire that consular officers occasionally go to. So there are a few, but there aren't very many. Most everything is in Washington, D.C. It's not all in the main State Department building. They've got 6 buildings scattered around, plus the Foreign Service Institute where the training goes on, but in Northern Virginia. But most of them are in Washington, D.C. If you're planning on serving in the U.S. and you're in a generalist, then odds are that the only places you're going to have an option to go are Washington or New York. Yes, back there.
Along like the line of internships, like if I was to take an internship and started out there like East Asia or something, and then was able to get into the foreign service, like you were saying, oh, there's like a lot of flexibility to move around. Like if you go to one area, would they only send you to that area, or?
No. You mean if you've taken an internship, you don't want to get just stuck in one area. If you have Spanish, for instance, and you go to another area having already had Spanish, there's a good chance that you can get a Spanish-speaking post coming back anywhere else. Or if you have French, there's a good chance you could go to French-speaking Africa, or English in much of the rest of Africa. And no, they're not going to pigeonhole you into just one place based on an internship, based on language training. Then if they give you 2 years of language training to learn Cantonese, then they will probably want you to go to Hong Kong or somewhere else where they speak Cantonese twice, but not right in a row during the course of your career at some point.
Is it hard for like, I know it's not like easy to get in the foreign service, but like if most people generally work hard enough, can they get into it, like into the foreign service?
Well, that's one reason that I spoke about alternatives, because maybe not. The exam process is difficult by any measure, and these negotiations that they have going on where they haven't settled it, part of the exam has been and will be a biographic part where you describe yourself and your experience. And some people, based on that description, will get more points than other people. Yeah. So that, and then just the multiple choice part of it also is, it's not easy. You have to pass back when I took it, I don't know what it is now. When I took it, about 90%, only about 10% passed the written exam, and then about 20% of them, or 2% of the initial group, got offers. But you can take it more than once. They offer it twice a year now, and I did. But then you have to pass everything. Yes?
Is language training on Washington, or do they do some of it on site? And then a follow-up question, what can you tell me about the new, I forget what the State Department is calling it, but have more people outside of the embassy within the country?
Yeah. What is that new initiative? Diplomatic readiness. The outreach program. Increasingly, who wants to guess which the largest diplomatic mission for the United States is anywhere in the world? Where would you guess? No, you cheated. That's right. Yeah, it's Iraq. I mean, it used to be places like London, Paris, Tokyo, Moscow, but now it's Iraq. There are 200 foreign service officers in Iraq. In a normal embassy, of the core ones that I'm talking about, like a mid-sized embassy like the one that I'm at, there are of those 5 cones, there may be 10, 15 officers. And then a lot of others. But the language. What were the 2 questions about the diplomatic outreach?
Where language training?
Language training. It's mostly in Washington. There are some exceptions they do, but you plan on Washington.
And then the other question was about the new program.
Yeah. There are initiatives to get people out into places that are not traditional diplomatic havens.
About what percentage of officers go out?
As many as want to. I mean, if you want to do that, you can do that. It's not hard. Into those outreach programs, transformational diplomacy. That's what it's called. Transformational diplomacy. to those transformational diplomacy destinations, a very small percentage, maybe 1-2%, Foreign Service officers. But they can be career-enhancing experiences.
Does it matter which track or which cone?
If for those places you can cross over on cones with increasing readiness and probability of doing it. If you're a management officer and you want to take a political job, it's hard to get that job in Paris or in Berlin or in Tokyo, but if you are doing it in Sana'a, Yemen, or in Kirkuk, Iraq, you got it. Yes?
When should we take the exams? A year before graduating, or whenever? Is there a time frame when you should start to take that?
It takes quite a while. If you pass the exam, it takes quite a while to get through the whole hiring process. They have to do a security clearance, they have to do a medical clearance, and those take some time. They've been trying to cut the time down. It used to be a year from the time you took the exam until the earliest you'd get an offer. They've been trying to cut that time down substantially, and with some success. It's 6 to 9 months, I think, is what they're looking at now.
Just a quick question. You said that all the Latin American positions are not too competitive. Does that include Mexico City embassy? I heard that it's pretty competitive. So.
Well, it's a matter of comparison. And what kind of job you're looking for there. If you want to be the economic counselor in Mexico City, that's probably pretty competitive. If you want to be a visa officer, you probably got the job. Yeah. Anything else? One more?
One more about offers, job offers. Is it expected that as soon as they make you an offer, you take it? Or can you say, I'd like to be in the Foreign Service, I'll take the exam now, and I'd like to enter in 3 years?
I don't think you can do that. What happens, at least what used to happen, I don't know, when I joined, what happened was this, and I think they continued with something like this. Now you have to identify what cone you're applying to. Back in the old days, they could make multiple offers in different cones. But they would make an offer, and if you accept it, you're in. If you turn it down, they would keep you on the register to make another offer for, I think, up to 18 months. That's the way it used to be. You better check and ask. I don't know what the answer is now. In fact, maybe to close out, let me give you some websites. You may already know these. http://hrweb, hrweb.hr.state.gov, and the other one is careers.state.gov. They describe quite a bit, and I checked, but they don't have the update yet for the new exam. I guess that's still pending. Thank you.